Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're here exploring the growing importance of connected intelligence, and in particular, how we might start to unlock what we're calling the grey space in UK transport. These are often seen as the gaps between systems, teams, organisations, and decisions where things often slow down, disconnect, or quietly get missed. I'm Matt, Fujitsu's Chief Digital Officer for Transport, and I'll be moderating this wonderful panel and this discussion over the next hour. The topic is across UK transport, we're seeing significant change, devolution, bus franchising, digitalisation, and wider reform, all creating opportunity, but also increasing complexity. Many organisations are dealing with more data, more partners, and more decisions than ever before, often without a complete picture. That tension is exactly what today's conversation is really about. We'd also love for your input throughout today. So as we go, please use the chat to share questions, reflections, or experiences, particularly where you recognize the grey space is in your organization. We'll also be running a few live polls during the session, so do take part when these pop up. I'm delighted to be joined today by three excellent panelists, each bringing a different perspective from across the sector. We're joined by Anne Marie Purcell, Will Redaway, and Thomas Ableman. I'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get going. Right, over to you, Anne Marie.
Hi, thanks, Matt. I'm Anne Marie Purcell, and I was formerly Chief Transformation Officer at Transport for Greater Manchester. It's accountable for delivering bus franchising and the B network. I'm now an advisor, providing advice across authorities across the UK. The reason for my backdrop, and I was asked to mention this, is I'm in beautiful Koh Samui. So I apologise if my Wi-Fi goes a bit awry, and Matt will deal with that, as I'm sure he will. In terms of why this particular topic matters to me, for me, the grey space is everything that sits between the formal accountabilities in transport. So the handovers, the interfaces, the customer journeys across modes. So I think it's really important we explore this topic, and I'm really delighted to be here today. Thanks, Matt.
Will.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, Matt. My name is Will Redaway. I'm currently Innovation and Strategy Manager at Vodafone 3, but I have over a dozen years of infrastructure experience delivering and leading innovation programs. And this fits in really nicely with my experience, and the reflection for me of why this is a particularly important subject is because I see a lot of opportunity to transform the industry, driving change and delivering value at the point of interface between major projects and infrastructure to the end user that ends up using the infrastructure. So I think exploring this topic is going to be very exciting. I'm really interested to see where the conversation takes us. So thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Will. And Thomas.
Good afternoon. So my name is Thomas Ableman. I'm the founder of a business called Freewheeling, which is currently just me. I was, until 2 years ago, the Director of Strategy and Innovation at Transport for London. Before that, I led a venture capital-backed startup, a digital marketplace platform. And prior to that, I was at National Express, a very traditional corporate, and spent 7 years as Commercial Director at Chiltern Railways, which I will die on the hill for being the most entrepreneurial and innovative train company in the country at the time. So I've kind of had this alternating career of very corporate organizations and very entrepreneurial ones, which I think is one of the reasons why I find this topic really interesting. And the reason, when Matt first suggested it, I was like, yep, absolutely, that is exactly what we need to be talking about, because a lot of my work is supporting UK and indeed other cities on trying to move out of modal silos and towards a greater culture of integration, empowerment, and innovation. And it's exactly the topics that we're going to be talking about today that are the barriers to achieving that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone, and great to have you with us. So let's kick off by exploring where the grey space actually exists today and how that shows up in real decisions. So the question to the panel is where do you most often see decisions being made without having the full picture? Thomas, as you are ready to go, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. In one sense, I'd almost challenge the premise of the question in the sense that it is impossible to make decisions with the full picture. There is no such thing as the full picture. And I think part of the challenge is that there's this desire to create the full picture. Often this results in what I call giganticism, organizations becoming bigger and bigger and ultimately more bureaucratic. When I saw a bit of this at TfL, which was once upon a time, if you go back 20 years ago, was organized into relatively small business units. They've now become what they promised to be when they were set up 25 years ago, the world's most integrated transport authority. But actually, in trying to become more and more integrated organizationally, that just results in ever larger, more complex organizations. Because what it doesn't allow you to do is work through those skills of accepting you don't have all the information and how to work across organizational and modal silos, even without the full information. We're always going to have knowledge boundaries. We're always going to have organizational boundaries. And the real challenge is how to chase down those customer experiences and how to chase down those multimodal outcomes, even when we don't have full knowledge, full picture, and above all, full organizational control.
That's great. And Anne Marie, what's your experience on this?
So my experience is, if I look at bus franchising particularly, which I've most recently been involved in, for me, we don't have all the answers because it's new. I mean, I know TfL, didn't deregulate, so therefore it's somewhere to learn from. But ultimately, franchising is new, so we can't possibly have all the picture of what we need to do and how we need to do it. I mean, in GM, we were the first to do it, so hopefully we're trying to kind of explore lessons learned, etc. I think the positives with devolution is that it allows decision making to be locally close to the network, which I think is really important. I think it allows delivery to be local, which I think is of franchising, which I think is really important. It's much harder to do something that's central. I think where the gaps are right now, though, is particularly in the world of bus franchising and trying to create integrated networks, is that we don't have that kind of central place of knowledge, which because through devolution and all the positives of that, it is very local, and that means that we don't necessarily have a central knowledge bank building up. And I think there is a lot of people out there who have lots of different knowledge but don't have all the answers. And it's about, for me, to try and solve the grey spaces, to try and pull that knowledge together into something that can actually improve passenger outcomes across the UK rather than just purely in devolved authorities. So for me, if we can, anything we can do to solve that kind of gap that helps to drive decision making, which allows local people to take local control, but allows a central kind of UK-wide process. Because the reality is the franchise and borders that, there's no borders, is there? Buses and rail and bikes and everything else move across them borders, and we need to accept that even with devolution, we have to accept we're one country, and we need to move across it seamlessly, really. So I'm hoping that's where we're making decisions where I think we could potentially get a little bit siloed.
And I guess from a customer perspective as well, it's that they don't see those borders. They only see the service, don't they? So it's you can expect maybe a few drops in levels of quality and stuff like that in those kind of areas. That's
definitely.
Yeah, exactly. Will, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, just to pick up on Thomas's point, I mean, I think it's right. We end up over-intellectualizing things, and that creates delays and complexity rather than actually focusing on the delivery and learning how to be agile across the whole program of works. But I mean, I've seen it firsthand starkly at the interface between the capital delivery side of things and the operational service. That there's that interface that doesn't seem to click very well. Because in major projects, we often incentivize the contracting teams to hit physical milestones, whether that's pouring concrete, laying tracks, doing certain things. And we don't consider the whole data requirements of the people who will eventually run the railway, the road, the service that sits behind the infrastructure that's being built. So we're effectively handing over a physical asset with an analog operational manual. And we leave the operators to then retrofit intelligence later. And that decision not to treat that digital twin, or to treat the digital twin as a nice to have, ends up costing a huge amount of money to retrofit. And I believe that's a core deliverable and that's the bit that misses the gap between the delivery program and the operational program. And if you just look, the construction is almost too late. You have to have it at a design stage. So when the concept of even a bus route or a new railway or a new piece of infrastructure, not just looking at the location, but looking at how services feed into it right before the sign off is, in my opinion, a critical element to consider, and how everything interfaces together.
Well, I think it actually comes before that as well, because I completely agree with you. But even when we think about, we're going to put in a new hospital or a new housing estate, we're not, for me, are we thinking about the transport before we even think, because you're then getting the delivery from a capital perspective when we've got in and put in a new junction or a new guided busway, a busway or whatever. But actually, I think I agree with you. We haven't thought about the operations, but equally, before we even think about the transport, we should have way back before we even put in the plan and permission for the new housing estate. Like transport, we expect to solve the transport once the housing estate's there. And actually, we should be thinking about the transport when we're thinking about building a housing estate or whatever it is that we're trying to build. So I agree. I think them connections are missing completely, and we need to get better at them.
I think one of the things that in this country, especially, we have developed a norm of building is we literally get it the wrong way around. We do project, plan, place. We start with a project and we deliver that project. Then once we've got the project, we think, what are we going to use this thing for? And at the very end of the process, does this project, which has often dropped out of space into a place that has no awareness of it whatsoever, do we think, what is the implication this has for place? And the Ordsall curve is the most famous example, where we literally built a project where there was no viable plan. But repeatedly, HS2 being a spectacular example, do we start with project-based thinking? And the countries, and I'm 12 minutes in, so I'm going to mention Switzerland. The countries that are best at this are those that start with, what are the societal objectives from place? What does that mean for the physicality of place? What is it that we need to deliver in terms of outcomes? What plan does that need? Oh, what projects are necessary to deliver that plan? And you literally get to the project at the very end. And if you look at almost, I did this exercise just for fun. If you rank all of the projects over the last 25 years in order of spend, we have spent hundreds of billions of projects that were solely driven by transport objectives, more capacity generally, sometimes faster journey times, but generally more capacity, without any real context of the places they're meant to serve.
I agree, and I think there has to be a drive of outcome-focused delivery, but not just for milestones. There has to be, what is the outcome? So as Anne Marie was saying, are we trying to feed a hospital with patients, or a local community centre, or a train station? Is it a business hub? We are very good at doing things in isolation, and we do this actually pretty well in this country. But it's that outcome focus of what's the end game, and then that's somebody else's problem, because we've delivered the project, the concrete is down, the building is there, the infrastructure is in place. Now it's somebody else's problem to try and knit those things together, when actually the best time to do it is when you're conceiving it in the first place. So I completely agree. I mean, I think your perspective on Switzerland as well is a prime example of that.
I mean, it's really easy to throw stones at failed projects. So let me use an example of one that's actually been really successful, which is where I live, the Victoria Line upgrade of 2009. Can't remember exactly how much, let's call it a £10 billion project to increase capacity. Desperately needed. Those trains were full. Stations, Victoria, Euston, King's Cross, routinely having to close because there wasn't insufficient capacity. Very successful upgrade of signalling, track and trains to enable the highest frequency railway outside Moscow in Europe. Everywhere a triumph. However, if you just stop and step back, and our system can't compute this way of thinking, and say, well, actually, what are we trying to achieve in terms of place, in terms of employment, in terms of the kinds of environment people want to live in? You wouldn't solve that capacity problem by increasing the capacity of the Victoria Line. You'd say, how do we make the places where the Victoria Line goes through more attractive places to set up businesses so people don't need to commute? Where are the other employment hubs? Walthamstow is just down the road from Stratford, but the train line was closed in the 60s, but there's a 300-metre cord that could be reconnected. How can we enable people to go to other places? Let's put in a dockless bike scheme to give people other choices. Let's make these better connected communities with stronger economies. That's what the place wants. But we don't do that. And I say a successful project, but ultimately, all it does is enable more people to do what they were already doing, as opposed to fundamentally changing societal outcomes.
And do we think that people assume that perhaps someone else is potentially looking at this? Do people think that it's sits slightly outside of their remit? It's viewed as someone else's problem? And if so, why do you think that happens?
We are a very hierarchical, compliance-focused, contract-focused, task-based sector. We have a very kind of militaristic, yes, sir, look up to the boss mentality, which is quite understandable because at the core of what we do, we have the potential to kill people on a daily basis, and generally we don't. So it works. Obeying the rules works, but it makes the kind of thinking I just described, which is quite out of the box thinking, really difficult. If you go and talk to people in Google, for example, who do not generally have the ability to kill people in the way that we do, and therefore have been able to develop a different organizational culture and haven't got 200 years of history, but only founded 20 years ago, if you go and talk to them, their boss will often have no idea what they're working on because they're not expected to do what the boss says. They're expected to find outcomes that will add to the organization's overall goals as very clearly expressed. Everyone knows what they're there to achieve, and then form internal coalitions and external coalitions to achieve those outcomes. And that's so far from our way of thinking. And I am not saying that people in safety critical roles should throw away the compliance manual and just form organizational collaboration to try to find all different ways of achieving safety outcomes. Do not do that. But actually, in terms of some of the digital outcomes and some of the customer experience outcomes and some of the strategic outcomes where your work isn't safety critical, we do need to become much better working in a collaborative way, building coalitions and not just doing what the boss says. And the most important person in this is the boss. And if you're listening to this and you're someone's boss, you've got to be giving your people permission to not just do what you want them to do. Because otherwise we will simply end up, as we always end up, with lots and lots of modal hierarchies within organizations and within the entire network.
I actually also think it's to do with, I'm going to say two contradictory statements in one go. One is we have ambition to deliver. We get funding and we need to use that funding. So there's a speed to deliver, which is great because often projects don't deliver. And I'm with you, Thomas. I like to talk about the things that do achieve because that's where we really learn, benefits and how do we do things better. But for me, there's a bit of we've got funding, and we've got to deliver and we've got to spend that money in, a time allocated way or whatever that is. So I think we need to, and we know how long things can sometimes take. So we want to get out the blocks and we get on with it. So there's a little bit of that comes into it, Matt, rather than standing back and kind of going, is this the right thing to do? It's like, well, we've got a certain amount of money and we've got to spend it within a given period of time. And these seem like the right things to do. So we do them. So again, going back to what Thomas said about planning and designing before we actually even start the project. But then on the other side of the camp, I think we also labour ourselves, going back, to what Thomas said about safety and all of that, and local authorities. We also overemphasise governance. So we spend a lot of time kind of going through layers of governance to tick boxes off, and I sometimes worry that what is the box that we're ticking? We're ticking that we've got certain conditions in place, we're ticking certain risk assessments off, we're ticking, and actually, have we started from the point of, is this the right, going to deliver the right outcome, is the first question. And I know we spend a lot of time doing business cases and all of that's good stuff, but I'm still not quite sure we get to the heart of that sometimes. Using the right skills, to be honest, to think as Thomas would. I'm a deliverer by trade. I don't necessarily, I'm not Thomas. I get things done. I get things delivered. So I agree, and we often get blamed when things don't deliver the outcomes because that piece of work beforehand hasn't necessarily translated through to the project properly. So I'm not that person, often the person to think like that. It's certainly people like Thomas, but we should be given projects that actually deliver outcomes, and then we get them delivered, for me. So a bit of both, a bit too much governance, but also a bit too much, right, we've got to deliver, we've got to spend this money, so let's spend it, you know?
I just want, yeah, I mean, I just want to amplify a couple of the points that Anne Marie and Thomas have said. I think this issue persists because of this contractual moat that exists. So, the siloing of things, whether it's commercial, technical, operational, whatever. But as an industry, we need to start to realize value. It has to travel horizontally rather than vertically, and I think we're not very good at translating that. I think also going back to Thomas's point, in the UK infrastructure space, our contracts are designed to transfer risk, not to share it. And I don't think we have a good risk sharing capability. So when a contractor steps into that grey space that Matt talks about to fix an integration issue between two systems, for example, they often inadvertently accept the liability for it. And so then the rational commercial decision is to stay in your lane. Don't get involved. Somebody else's problem. And then what that results in is a massive cost where we end up with lots of point solutions that work perfectly in isolation, but they fail to talk to each other or fail to integrate across the whole ecosystem. And we had a lot of, this is one of the reasons Crossrails was delayed, is because of all the different signaling systems not integrating properly together. But it also leads to very, very expensive retrofits and a very, very disjointed passenger experience. And we've all had this app fatigue where you have to use lots of different apps just to get the information you want. So on your handover, you end up with multiple systems and multiple elements to manage rather than just one ecosystem. And I think it's that lack of thinking of it doesn't matter who the person or the company is that feeds into this ecosystem, but people are seeing the individual elements within the ecosystem as individual rather than looking at it as a whole. And I think it's a massive mindset shift that I don't think everyone kind of gets yet. And it's very hard, following the as Anne Marie and Thomas said, the safety issues, the contractual issues, the governance issues. It's not impossible, but I mean, it's a big nut to crack, and people don't really want to try and do it. And if not everyone's trying to do it, we'll never get there, and you end up with these point solutions in this grey space that actually creates a lot of innovation, but a lot of harm or more complexity than it should be delivering, in my opinion.
We've had a question from the audience around this whole reframing the grey space, from someone else's problem to a shared reality type of thing. And they mentioned, obviously, Tom, you mentioned being at Chiltern Railways and being led by Adrian Shooter. This person's question is very much success is driven often by very charismatic leaders. Are we training the next generation to be leaders of that generation? Is charisma, is kind of that the way that people share responsibility and delegate and move and think differently, is that an essential ingredient when we're talking about all of these aspects where people are just continuing what the previous generation has done, or is trying to do something different but is shifted back into certain lanes? So do we think, are we training the next generation to be leaders, or are we training them to cross T's and dot I's?
On that quite, sorry, you go first, Sam. No, go first, Anne Marie. No.
I was going to say that as someone with a 21-year-old who's in the world of work, I think working from home is causing a massive. I'm going to be someone who puts it out there. I think working from home is causing a massive issue with training our leaders.
Oh dear.
And couldn't work from home, so was always the first one. Have you lost me? Oh.
Just a quick break, but you seem to be back with us.
Oh, right. Okay. I've frozen on the screen, but that's okay. Yeah. I might switch my.
It's a good image. Don't worry. It's a good image that's frozen.
Can you still hear me? Oh.
I tell you what we'll do. Thomas, if you want to jump in, And we'll let Anne Marie solve those connectivity bits.
I mean, just to an extent echo Anne Marie. I mean, I think working from home has huge benefits for certain tasks on certain occasions, but I spend the vast majority of time, as I am now, in client offices. And when I was at TfL, I spent a lot of time in TfL's offices. The question is charisma an essential ingredient that John's asked. Charisma's good. It helps. I helped facilitate the Metro Mayor's Away Day last year, and you really saw Andy Burnham as the most charismatic man in the room. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Manchester is the leader. I'd say ahead of London at the moment in terms of driving change in transport. But I actually don't think that charisma is an essential ingredient. I think Adrian Shooter's charisma really helped him lead Chiltern Railways. But the most important thing was clarity of the outcome that we're trying to achieve. Everyone knew what we were there to do. Everyone knew what his vision was for the railway. He meant it. When we were building capital projects, we built a new line to Oxford, the first new rail link to London for 100 years. We knew why we were building it. It was an absolute example of the Bent Flyberg plan slow, build fast. And we could do that because the outcomes were absolutely clear. So yes, it's nice to have charismatic leaders, but I think it's far more important to have leaders who are capable of setting a long-term strategic vision. And probably one of the most underappreciated aspects of innovation is meant to be fast-paced, but it only works if you have long-term clarity of strategic direction.
Anne Marie, back to you.
Sorry about that. I think so. I do think working from home is an issue. That's a very brief point, because I genuinely think, how do we train people when they're sat behind cameras 5 days a week? So I do think we need to get more into hybrid, and we of the older generation need to accept that's our responsibility if we want proper leaders of the bar.
Seems we've lost you a bit, Anne Marie, again. So, Will, did you want to just jump in?
I mean, I've got probably nothing quite as insightful as Thomas or Anne Marie. One thing I will say, I mean, I think Thomas has answered the bit about charisma. I think leaders actually, we need more brave leadership. We need leaders who are willing to put their head above the parapet, are willing to get a few bloody noses, try things. Sticking to the tried and tested is all very well and good. And I have been to lectures many years ago where they were still teaching about concrete from 1970s handbooks. Now, in principle, concrete hasn't really evolved a huge amount, but now there are lots of different additives and things you can do with concrete that you couldn't do 40, 50 years ago. So you can innovate even with things like concrete. So, but my point about leadership is having that vision and being brave and supporting your teams to say, look, let's try and do things differently. If it doesn't go wrong, we'll axe it quickly. But the important thing is learning. And I'm going to say the dreaded words, lessons learned. Sorry, I had to swear, but those things are not learned. We create a lot of lessons. Actually, no, we create a lot of learning. We don't necessarily create the lessons from them. And we're very bad at tapping into that knowledge and reapplying that knowledge, because everyone wants unique solutions. My project is different. My project is this. My project is that. But actually, the core basis of most projects follow the same pattern, whether it's through just the procurement and the legal routes and the contractual routes, NEC contracts and everything else. But actually, there's a lot of different ways that we could be doing things, but there has to be a massive shakeup. And it's expensive, it's scary, it's tricky, and we're worried about more wasted money if this doesn't work. But then you look at things like HS2, I'm sorry to say, it's the scope creep is increasing, and the amount of the outcome-based delivery that we're talking about is being pushed further away. So we're thinking, well, where's the value in that? And sometimes value is not just pounds and pence, what you see on the balance sheet. It's the whole life, not whole life cost, the whole life value of that investment. And it's all the incidentals that you get as a result of that. That's very hard to quantify. That's my take on it. Brave leadership, basically. That's what I was trying to get to.
And just building on that for a second, I think one of the things that we have lost and certainly need to build back is the ability to think more in a portfolio perspective as opposed to every single individual project. So let me give you an example. Let me tell you about a completely insane project. This is a project that electrified a railway for high density services into open countryside, just as that piece of land was dedicated as greenbelt. It was mad. Now, that was the Central Line extension to Ongar in the 1950s. Obviously, complete idiocy, made a mistake, shouldn't have happened. It was part of a whole series of underground extensions that more or less built the railway, the underground network that we have today, the Central Line, Piccadilly Line, Bakerloo Line, that's now the Jubilee Line. All of that happened as part of a new programme of works, which included one idiotic mistake. No one even remembers the idiotic mistake. The line was closed 30 years later. Everyone forgot it was ever there. Every so often, there will be a project disaster. There always has been, there always will be, and there's nothing you can do about it. But the mistake we make is treating every single project individually that it must succeed. And that's an utterly unrealistic expectation and causes us to panic, pull the drawbridge up, and try and prevent it ever happening again, which is impossible, as opposed to looking at the portfolio of projects and say, actually, overall, this portfolio has been a success. What did we get wrong with the ones that didn't work? And let's celebrate the successes of those that did.
And
I'll give it one more. I was going to give it one more go. Sorry.
Go for it.
I'll give it one more go. I've left my camera up. So I think charisma helps. I think of having worked with Andy in Manchester, he's very clearly a charismatic lead. But I think the key thing for me is setting a clear direction that everybody could follow. I knew what he was looking for. And as a result, I knew what I was looking for and I knew what I was delivering. I was very clear on what I needed to deliver. I made sure everyone in my team was very clear. And I think the other thing is not expecting gold. I have this view, and leaders should follow. For me, this is what leaders should follow, is 80%. Nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect. Nothing we do is ever perfect. And striving for complete and utter perfection will never deliver any change. You have to accept 80%. If you get my view, and I said this in the programme, if we deliver on time and on budget and we deliver 80% of what we said, and if some of that's back office stuff that we don't hit, well, then that's okay. And I can live with that. And, I'm very proud about what we did in GM under Andy. It wasn't perfect, certainly wasn't. And each phase got, started off like a Ryanair landing, then we went for an EasyJet, and then we just about hit a British Airways. We were never going to hit a Qatar. It was a massive transformation, or an Emirates, or whatever your favourite airline is. So as long as we learned and we improved, I was fine with that. And some moments were a bit hairy on the landing, but we got it. And I think if leaders expect 100%, they'll deliver nothing. It's far better to deliver 80% of something than 100% of nothing. And so I was really clear. I understood what Andy's vision was. I understood, the charisma was there. I understood what he wanted. But I was also really clear on we had to hit a date. We wanted to hit a date because we wanted to deliver the outcomes. And if we got 80%, we could improve from there on in. And that's what we aimed at. And I think leaders need to give that direction to people. And a bit of charisma goes a long way as well at the same time, doesn't it? So
the tragedy is that HS2 is, in many ways, if you look at the history of it, a railway that was designed to be perfect with perfect risk mitigation. And that's why we've ended up where we've ended up.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so it feels, there's leadership, there's decision making and stuff. So what do you feel might be like the everyday decisions that are quietly shaping this grey space more than perhaps people realize?
I mean, probably the single biggest one is actually the one we've just spoken about, which is the fear of failure. That makes it incredibly hard to build those successful cross-functional teams, those cross-organizational projects, when every single individual leader of those teams is trying to mitigate risk. It just doesn't work. You need to be able to compromise between them. I think another one is the fact that we have these very production-led incentives across our sector, which again makes it very hard to break out of the silos and put a customer on an outcome-focused lens on. So it's leadership incentivization makes it very hard.
I mean, my view, getting down to the operational layer, I think there are everyday decisions that quietly shape this grey space. I think more than people note, stuff that will never land in a strategy document, a timetable tweak, but breaks a connection that people don't realise, some highways diversions that don't align with bus operations or rail, some depot allocations that affect punctuality, customer information that doesn't exactly deliver. Ghost buses is one of them things. Somebody doesn't do a cancel it. It's, yes, there is the strategic element, but there's also just, you can have, going back to that perfection thing, you can plan this network and you can plan this perfectly in your mind. And even if you deliver it on day one perfectly, that's great. But then on a day-to-day basis, there's little tiny decisions that are being made for all the right reasons that then affect that reality. And I think they're the spaces we need to get into them spaces and making sure we're thinking about, well, if we make that timetable tweak, what is the ongoing consequences? If we do a reallocation in a depot, what is that knock-on effect, So I agree, Thomas, it's the leadership, but also getting down into the real low level. We might have this beautiful strategic idea of an integrated transport network, and then on a daily basis, just operational decisions might knock that to knock it to the right. And we have to learn to to deal with that and accept that, because that's a reality of life. But we also need to find ways of solving them problems and giving that feedback and making sure them decisions are made slightly differently next time. So for me, some of it is, the strategic stuff, but also just the day-to-day operational decisions need to be thinking about, the broader knock-on effect to an integrated transport network, really.
And Will, do you have any thoughts, perspectives?
Yeah, so I think we're heavily constrained because of traditional appraisal methods, like the Treasury Green Book, for example, and we often struggle to quantify those long-term wider benefits of innovation or solutions to compete on narrow cost benefit terms and so on and so forth. So for example, every time we write a tender and we ask for a specific solution or technology, and I think this goes back to Anne Marie's point about striving for the 100%, we think about we don't think about that performance output. So what's the guaranteed real-time visibility that this solution will provide? So whether it's, look at DFT, the bank upgrade, they had a specific outcome when they, Thomas will probably know more about this, but Dr. Simon Ableman did this reverse procurement approach where his target was to get X amount of thousand people through the station per hour, or whatever the metric was. That was all he was focused about. And he sought a broad approach from lots of different SMEs and specialists to come and solve that one particular problem. How they were going to build it after that was almost second. It was, I need X amount of people through my station. This is how we focus it. So if we lock ourselves into rigid solutions that can't adapt to the changing landscape, not just in technology, but society as well, we end up with, the just throwing solutions out because we blind ourselves with what we're, with all the legalese and the traditional methods, rather than actually understanding what the opportunities are to actually flip procurement on its head and actually completely reverse engineer everything. And I think the other silent killer, in my opinion, is data. I'm going to use that sort of geeky word, data, and data taxonomy, because, for example, and it goes back to the silos we were talking about previously in the conversation, if Team A labels something, a bridge, differently to Team B in their database, we've now created a permanent digital disconnect that even the best AI systems won't be able to fix. So there's lots of this, these constraints going on, where we can't actually adapt to the changing landscape, and we just try and force a traditional method. And I think I saw on the chat about how do we overcome this. I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead, Matt, very quickly, but I'm just going to plant this seed. I'm not going to talk around it.
Please continue. Go.
About challenging the leadership, and it actually costs nothing just to ask a question. You don't need a budget to ask a person who receives the orders or the vision for permission or a question. You can ask a very simple question like, what do you actually want to do with this? How can I do this to make your life easier? What does good look like? Going back to the bank example, the exam question was more people through the station. Everything else was obviously safety and everything else. Of course, it's important. but it's empowering staff, not just the leadership levels, but it's empowering the whole organization to be effectively a hive mind where we all work with each other to sort of say everyone's empowered to have an idea or a solution. And it goes back to Thomas's perspective of a portfolio. Rather than just focusing on one particular project and throwing loads of ideas at it, it's looking across the whole landscape and saying, if I twiddle this gear here, what is going to be the output of the whole portfolio? If it's inconsequential, go ahead and do it. If it's going to have a massive impact, let's have a bit more of a think about it. But it's actually empowering your staff and the contractors, specifically the contractors, and it doesn't have to be monetary, but it often is, to incentivize them to bring your innovations to the table, challenge us, challenge our designs. We don't know all the answers. Let's get to 80%. And I love that rule about let's not over polish it. So let's get a really good solution that's viable. It might not be perfect, but if it works and it addresses the majority of the challenges that we've got, we've won, because then you're not spending a tremendous amount more money doing all the remediation work, which costs industry a lot more, doing the retrofitting and the remediation work following a project failure. Sorry, I've gone on a bit too long there, but I got onto my soapbox a little bit. Apologies.
Let me just pick up on one thing you said at the start of that, which is about the challenges around Treasury and value for money and Green Book and all that, because there's also been a debate happening in the chat about that between Berenice and John while we've been talking. So I just want to come back to that point, because it's understandably a very is one that people feel very concerned about. But and what I'm about to say, I can see the audience rolling their eyes now, because I'm going to say something that makes it sound so easy. And to an extent, the point of someone like me as an outsider is to say this is doable, even though I know it's really hard on the inside. But there are 5 Treasury cases in the Green Book. There's not one. The economic case is 1 of 5. The strategic case is number 1, quite deliberately, because the strategic case defines why you're doing this. And the purpose of appraisal is then to assess whether or not you're achieving that strategic case. The problem is that it's often very hard to measure the strategic case using the tools available for appraisal, especially as the tools for appraisal have been handed down through generations of transport economy leadership over multiple decades. So, to use an analogy, I refurbished my bathroom last year. Why did I refurbish my bathroom? Well, the easily appraisable thing would be to say I did it to increase the value of my house. And I can measure that. And there's data that shows that refurbishing my bathroom will increase the value of my house by 5%, which is worth more than the cost of doing it. But actually, if I appraise it that way, there are other things I could do to increase the value more. So I could end up talking myself out of doing that project. But the reason I'm doing it is because I want to avoid the embarrassment of a shitty bathroom. Now, that's really hard to measure, but it's the reason I'm doing it. So if I can have a really clearly stated strategic case that explains why I'm doing it, and then evidence that, if when we get to the economic case, and the only thing we can measure is value, house price value, and that comes up with a negative BCR, that is fine. And it is fine. And on my podcast last year, I spoke to Johnny Mood, the director of the National Audit Office, who is responsible for public money, and I asked him very directly, is it okay to have a negative BCR? And he was like, totally fine. You do not need to have a positive BCR. You need to be able to evidence your strategic case. Now, the decisions go through multiple layers of officials, and not every official is up there with that stuff. Crossrail was articulated on the basis of a strategic case around transport agglomeration and the employment and economic benefits. London brought some of the money, long before my time. London brought some of the money. DfT were asked to fund the rest. Because it was a big project, that intellectual case was able to be made, which is often harder for small projects. But it is nevertheless true that the first of the 5 cases is strategic. So you can state why you are doing this and evidence it.
It's actually, Thomas, I agree with you on that, because if you look at some of the big projects, not transport, I'm going to step away from transport for a minute. If you look at the Familia in Barcelona, if you look at the Sydney Opera House, they would never, ever have delivered but no one would want to have a world without them. I mean, the Familia is still being built at the moment. It's way past its deliverables, and its outcomes. So, I mean, there are lots of projects, and that have delivered value way beyond anything economic, and you would not have had them projects. So I agree with you. We have to, but I do think it's difficult with tax, particularly with taxpayers funded projects. It is a real difficult place to put yourself in, and I understand the difficulties of decision makers, because obviously if it can't show payback to to the taxpayers in the timescales that it should do, then that makes it really difficult to justify. So I do understand that kind of challenging yourself, the challenging decision makers, but I also agree that not every project is about economic payback really for what you're spending in it. There is more to it. And to be fair, to some degree, franchising is it's not that it doesn't pay back, but franchising is about, moving from a commercial deregulated market where it's not just about, well, does this particular route make money? It's about, well, does this route connect people? Does it connect communities? Does it, at some point, there will be an massive economic payback, because if we can get people from one side of a city to another to make sure they can get to work or they can get to education. So that, for me, is why franchising, is, in my perspective, is important, regardless of the immediate economic payback, is because ultimately connecting people across cities and across the country drives economic growth. It might not happen in 2 years, but it will eventually do that. And you can see that in other countries where they've successfully integrated transport properly. But yeah, I agree. I always think about the Familia and the Sydney Hopper Hours when I think about whether something paid back in a lifetime or not.
So we've mentioned, we've gone across the constraints, decisions being made, leadership, and various other really useful insight. I wonder if, let's say, for example, you take the place of the audience just for this moment, and if someone wanted to start moving towards where we were talking about, like, and solving the grey space towards the direction of tomorrow and stuff, could you share any thoughts or where you feel there would be some realistic steps that they could take without like huge big programs or reorganizations? Is there any learnings about, something that someone could take away today and go, you know what, I'm going to do this today?
I mean, from my perspective, some of this is behavioral. If you want to get away from, we need to completely change our operating model or spend loads on programs, there's things like, going back to what Will said, one shared view of data matters, because how do you make decision making across various departments or organizations without a clear one set of data that helps you drive them decisions? Things like routines where you bring organizations together, so operators together, highways, planners, customer teams together to make sure they are talking to each other, them kind of routine behaviors where they talk to each other and drive decision making on the basis of what's the right outcome for the customer, not just necessarily a commercial decision. And then things like standardized definitions and KPIs. What are we trying to measure daily? What is our, it could be on reliability, disruption, whatever that is being really clear for everyone. Going back to that conversation about charisma, what are we trying to aim for, and are we all clear on what we're trying to aim for? And then clear decision routes and escalation. Really, I like to call it shallow governance, but shallow governance, and not loads of tiers, empowering people, but equally where you need to escalate or need to make more senior decisions, it's shallow and it's quick, and there are routes for people to get them decisions made quickly. They're kind of just a few things that I would say are not big programs, but are things that you could do more behaviorally rather than structurally to make a bit of a difference.
Let me pick up on that, because I think that's absolutely right. And just building on that shallow governance point, one of the biggest reasons why this grey space exists, it's between silos in organizations as much as between organizations. And a big part of that is that we manage hierarchically in those silos. So, a chief officer will set a plan for their area, and then they'll cascade those to directors who'll set plans for their teams, who'll cascade those down. And everyone therefore does what their boss wants, and that's great. Isn't that good? What's not to like? The problem with that is that all of those resources are locked into those priorities, but in an increasingly connected world, we can't deliver without everyone else. But everyone else is working to their plan. So what we have is vast amounts of resource locked unproductively, awaiting resource in another area that is unavailable because they're working to a different set of priorities. And in effect, we've kind of, did you see that? I think it was in Oslo recently, where 4 articulated buses got stuck on a roundabout and they couldn't move because each one was blocking the one behind it, and they were stuck there for hours. Our organizations are kind of like that. Everyone is stuck awaiting the resource that's locked somewhere else because everyone is working to hierarchical plans. So the most important thing that could be done pretty effortlessly is for you as a leader to stop becoming part of the vetocracy. And that vetocracy is entirely well motivated by setting a local plan for your people, and instead empower your people to go away and work with whoever they need to work with to deliver outcomes. And it comes back to exactly Will's point earlier. It's not saying, I want 4 escalators and a lift. It's saying, I want people through the station, figure out how to do it, guys.
I mean, I think, and I'm going to go a bit idealistic on this as well, but I think because I have to inject a little bit of optimism as well. It's my job, but I think, but going more pragmatic initially, I think mapping and just to highlight your point, both of you and Anne Marie's point is mapping your dependencies and knowing who relies on your outputs is absolutely critical. At the moment, many major projects and portfolios don't have that mapping. And that's, to me, is quite simply the first step to intelligence. And it costs nothing but time. Now, obviously, time has a cost, but if you put in that time, that effort in initially, you recoup that value very quickly. But going back to my idealistic sort of perspective, if we need to stop talking about innovation projects. And as an innovation person, I actually say this with pride. We need to start calling it business as usual. And it goes back to your point, Thomas, is like, let's find the right people to do the job, and let's not be constrained by the hierarchy, the verticals. Let's think horizontally. And, I mean, in a more pragmatic sense, and from being out on sites in the past, instead of the site manager calling a meeting to discuss a delay that happened yesterday, the dashboard will flag up of things that might happen tomorrow. So you can start mitigating things in advance, and you're not fighting fires. You're actually creating value, on at the coal face, if anything. So we move from fighting fires in the grey space to orchestrating value across it. And I think that can happen. I think in the world of data now and the digital technologies that we've got now, and certainly the breadth and generations in organizations now, you have a really amazing opportunity of 30 plus years senior leaders with really innovative and different thinking younger generations, where if you can bridge the gap across the whole gamut in the organization, you can start to create some really powerful opportunities to cut across those traditional hierarchical values and traditional delivery values that Anne Marie was talking about earlier. And actually, this is where we can start to apply knowledge effectively to actually incorporate those lessons, but actually create skills and outcome-based solutions before the design stage. And I think that for me is a really exciting time. The tools exist now, and again, it goes back to that leadership or the constraints, and looking at the BCR and saying, well, actually, there's enough green on this to make me think we should just go ahead and do it. Let's be a pioneer. Let's get ourselves out of our comfort zone. But again, this is idealistically speaking, but the tools are there. It's just learning how to use them.
That's really great. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm gonna, before I start to move into like closing remarks and stuff like that, I'm gonna put you on the spot, as moderators can do. Thomas, let's start with you. If you wanted someone in today's audience to take something away, very succinctly and very clearly, what do you feel that would be the key thing for them to take?
I would want, if they're a leader of a team, to not feel that they've got to be telling their team members what to do, but instead setting them clear outcomes and getting them to go and work with the people who can make that happen. And if they are in a team, that they start role modeling that behavior themselves, but always with clarity of long-term outcome. And if you're anywhere near the middle of the top of the organization, either set or demand that clarity of long-term outcome.
Brilliant. Thank you. Anne Marie, your thoughts?
It's probably my main one as a deliverer, because that's what I do and I focus on delivering outcomes. That's kind of my whole career. For me, I always stick to that 80% rule. I said it before, I think a lot of things don't deliver because there is someone at the top, and equally a very, inspired engineer, particularly at the bottom, who is tinkering and is desperate for something to be perfect. It can come out, it can come from the top, and it can come from the bottom. And I think for me, if you take away something today, is aim to deliver outcomes that matter, but they don't always have to be perfection, because perfection is never achieved. There's always, as you go through a project, there's always something that isn't perfect. And for me, focus on the end game, not focus on getting it perfectly right, because if you do, you're more likely to deliver outcomes for people that you can improve upon.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anne Marie. Will, your thoughts?
I've got nothing really to add to the fantastic contributions that Thomas and Anne Marie have said. I think one thing, talking organizationally, and I think Thomas and Anne Marie have really, shared really good insights. Organizationally, I think relying on naive resources is really important, because bringing the same people in to try and solve the same problem, you'll get similar results, or you'll get the most senior engineer, the most revered engineer, who'll just reverse engineer their solution to fit the challenge. So I think bringing in, not being shy to bring in those naive resources, and then leadership also learning, and this is going to sound really strange, learning to celebrate failure. And this is a really strange thing to celebrate. Now, I'm not suggesting celebrating things which are really bad, but we tried something, it failed. Oh, well, fantastic. Let's try again, but do it differently this time. And I think I saw a comment pop up. I'm afraid I can't multitask and read and speak at the same time, but saying about business as usual. But we should move away but business as usual, but better, I think the comment said. Absolutely. But I think if business as usual, you turn up and you're excited to be at work and you're solving problems and everyone's contributing and everyone's having fun and you're making mistakes, but no one's telling you off for it. I think that creates, and it goes back to my generational gamut within an organization and why that's really important to tap into, because there's so much untapped potential, not just at the younger generation, but across the whole organization. And I think if you can learn how to play together, I think, because you've all got the same toys, I think learn to play more effectively together.
Matt, can you give me just 2 seconds to respond to Will?
Yeah, please.
I fully agree. The amount of people who didn't understand why I was in charge of bus franchising, because I had no transport experience, is off the scale. Honestly, I think people were like, who is this woman? Like, she's come from no transport background. And the amount of people I hear that, you've got to have transport experience to deliver. Look, we're locking out not just younger generations who think transport experience means they've got to drive a bus. Well, no, it doesn't, or drive a train. But also it locks out women. It locks out innovation, people who think about innovative solutions. I'm not from a transport background, successfully delivered bus franchising in Manchester, because there's plenty of people who have that experience. We need to unlock it for people who don't have that experience. Sorry, Will, I had to jump in because it just made me chuckle, because I came into this 4 years ago with no transport experience. So it is possible to be naive to the subject matter and still achieve things.
I'm very much a fan of the phrase, which I'm sure you'll know which film this is at. You never know where a diamond in the rough is going to come from, and I think you need to remain open enough to recognise that does happen. And I think one of the audience's comments is, we need to stay outside of the box long enough to get a range of solutions, cross-sector learning, in order to give us the best chance of achieving those outcomes rather than restricting everything to begin with. So, a huge thank you to our panelists. Certainly shared some fab insights with us today. And I thank you as well, everyone who has joined online and contributed to today's discussion. I think you can agree, it's been rather lively, which is fantastic. There's not much else to say in terms of big takeaways. I would add that perhaps the greatest space is all around us, and I believe it's something that, from today's learnings, is something that we can start to tackle together. It exists in the spaces around and between systems, people, data, contracts, and organization, and each of us, I think, has a responsibility to connect rather than isolate. I think is just such an important thing to do. And it's shaped every day about how we write tenders, engage the supply chain, how we can ask better questions, and how willing I think we are to look beyond our immediate remit and have those conversations, key conversations earlier. And I think applied well, it can help us see far more clearly, align us more easily, and make better decisions. So I really hope you today have sparked some new ways of thinking, provided some insight for when you head back to your organizations. We'd love to keep the discussion going and look forward to seeing many of you at Interchange in Manchester in March. And if you'd like to stay connected in the run-up, we'll share a short form afterwards and we'll keep you posted. But again, thank you so much for everyone and hope you have a fab day.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye.